The Honorable Chief Justice and Associate Justices of the Supreme Court.
The House will come to order.
The Senate will come to order.
SJR 34 comes out of the Rules Committee unanimously. The bill proposes an amendment to the Oregon Constitution to allow a judge to teach at a public institution as well as serve in the Oregon National Guard while serving in the judicial branch without being in violation of separation of powers. In Oregon, a public institution of higher education cannot employ members of the judicial branch to teach classes unless those individuals do so on a voluntary basis without compensation. What this means in the case of law schools is this policy puts the University of Oregon Law School at a disadvantage to the two private law schools in Oregon, because the private law schools can hire members of the judicial branch while the University of Oregon cannot. So the bill does two things: refers to the voters to decide if members of the judicial branch should be allowed to teach with compensation at a public institution of higher education, and allows voters to clarify that a member of the judicial branch can serve in the Oregon National Guard while concurrently serving as a judge. I urge an aye vote.
Further discussion? Representative Wisnett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the bill.
To the resolution.
To the resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, honorable colleagues, I understand that rules did not have much testimony, or this bill was not in rules for discussion for a long period of time. We're asking here the voters to vote on changing the Constitution. We're asking them to change a very important aspect of our Constitution, the separation of powers. I don't have to read you. I was going to read you that, but you know what that says. The three branches of government. And no person charged with official duties under one of these departments shall exercise any of the functions of another except as constitutionally expressed provided. And that's what we're doing here. We've already talked this session, passed a bill about allowing legislative members to serve on school boards, and but this bill is saying that you can be employed by these other branches of government. I just have some concern about that. I think this needs more time and discussion before we allow this separation of powers amendment into our Constitution. I'd ask you to vote no, and let's go back and look and see if this is really good policy. We want to refer to the voters. And the bill's not just talking about teaching, it's talking about now the military service. The good representative majority leader from West Eugene and Junction City advised me that maybe with what we're going to do in education, it will be part of the it'll be more private than part of the executive branch anyway, but I think I would probably argue against that. So anyway, I think this is very important, changing the Constitution about separation of powers. I would ask you a no vote, and let's have more time to study this issue. Thank you.
Further discussion? Representative Gorsuch.
Good morning, colleagues. We, and with all due respect to my friend from rural Deschutes County, at Mount Hood, we teach some legal classes. I don't, because I don't have that background. But we have had a number of folks teach our 200-level law classes. We had a gentleman who was excellent for many, many, many years. But then when he was elevated to the status of a judge, he had to step down from teaching. And personally, I think that was a tremendous loss for us and for our students. So especially when it comes to education, I understand separation of powers, but I think it's so important to have those sorts of perspectives in the classroom that I would urge an aye vote. Thank you.
Further discussion? Representative Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the bill.
To the resolution.
To the resolution. This point relating to the conflict of the separation of our branches of government is a very important one. I was thinking, of Representative Greenlick and how much of a of value he would be if he worked with the Oregon Health Authority. Except that, because he's serving here, it would be inappropriate, in my opinion, for him to be working for the legislative branch and representing the people and working for the executive branch, even though he's tremendously qualified for it. Our founders were wise when we had a separation of our government into the judicial, the legislature, and the executive branches, and that we need to be very careful about thinking, well, we have good intentions, and so why don't we adjust that separation of power? I could see, if I were a university president and there was going to be some controversial bills come up before the court, the appellate court or Supreme Court, why not have those justices? I've never accused anybody of being, influenced, but if a justice was working as a professor, receiving a substantial salary for the very institution that's involved in a case, now we're going to have the judge either recuse himself or continue to be involved in a hearing on a case where he's got an inherent conflict of interest. There's wisdom in having a separation or branches of government. Nobody's forced to be a judge. When you make the decision, I will go on the bench, you're saying, and that means I will not go in the legislature, I will not teach any longer, or work for in any department that's controlled by one of the other branches of government, because our system is dependent on an independent judiciary. And so even though I understand the reasoning for this bill, if you really look at it from a larger standpoint and as to what the consequences can be, I think we're heading down the wrong road, and that we really need to do all that we can to ensure that the judiciary stays not just independent, but avoids the very appearance of a conflict of interest by allowing them to receive a paycheck from another branch of government. I think we really should vote no on this. Thank you.
Further discussion, Representative Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues, for what I think is a really fun debate. I know it's a little late in the session to be having fun. I'm sorry. I really respect what our colleagues have talked about, and Lord knows I love talking and thinking about separation of powers. It is important to think through. However, I urge a yes vote, and I think that the concerns in this case are overstated, respectfully. Now, separation of powers, it's an important concept. We all understand it. Hopefully, we serve in the legislature. However, it is not an absolute concept. For example, the judiciary reviews the constitutionality of legislation, of executive branch regulations. Similarly, our state Senate, in many important executive branch appointments, must confirm them. That violates separation of powers right there. But the branches are not entirely separate. They have checks and they have balances. Now, for the Oregon Supreme Court has interpreted the separation of powers within the state of Oregon as being slightly more rigid and slightly sharper than the federal Constitution. For example, the federal judges they can and do teach at University of Oregon Law School. There's no violation there. There's simply no intrinsic problem. Similarly, several Supreme Court justices teach over at Willamette Law School. Now, in this case, just because of, I think, perhaps the very rigid separation of powers that the state of Oregon has is relatively unique in just how sharp the separation is. I think that it produces an unfortunate result in that one particular instance. And I think that by I guess, softening the edge in this one case, it does not undermine separation of powers as we know it. The state of Oregon will still have relatively sharp separation of powers. I urge an aye vote.
Further discussion? Seeing none, Representative Hoyle, do you wish to close?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'd like to point out that we have a process to amend the Constitution, and this will be sent to the voters. And we also have precedent, because the legislature determined that teachers from public universities could serve in the legislature. So we have precedent for making these types of changes. And I think my good colleague mentioned that separation of powers is not an absolute, and we do have a more rigid interpretation at the state level than we do at the federal level. As he said, federal judges are allowed to teach at our institutions. And one more thing I would say is that if we have judges that want to serve their country or are serving their country in the National Guard, they should not be precluded from giving service to our community. I urge and I vote so that we can send this to the voters of the state of Oregon to make that determination.